All right, so today in the metal shop, we are going to make a small garden shovel. You never know when you're gonna have to dig a hole, you know, in a garden. So head on over to the metal rack and find some flat bar. So first step is to get some 1/2 inch flat bar. We're using 1/8 thick. Let's go cut it out to 18 inches. If you don't have a tape measure that can go long enough to go to 18, grab a ruler and just measure it out this way. So in this case, 12 plus 6. Make your mark. Use a square to get a nice straight line so you have a straight cut. And I'm just using a scribe to lay this out. You could use a Sharpie if you're very fine. So there's our 18-inch line. Use a hacksaw to cut it. Be careful of the long edge so it doesn't catch on anybody. Clamp it close to the vise. That way it doesn't vibrate and shake around. Start on a slightly downward angle with your hacksaw. Make a little mark to get it going, and use the full length of the hacksaw for your cut, not tiny little mouse cuts. Near the end of your cut, slow down so that you don't slip and hurt yourself. You can just break it off. Next, we want to quickly smooth out these edges so that nobody cuts themselves. After you've cut something, it tends to be kind of sharp. There's a burr on the end. I'm just going to hold that into a vise. Grab yourself a bastard file, and let's smooth this thing over. So we have this dirty piece of metal here. We want to clean it up, make it all shiny. So we're going to be using the files to clean it up. When I clamp it in the vise, I'm going to try to clamp it so that it's not down, it's not floating, because that's impossible. I want to get it just slightly above so I don't file the top of my vise. So if you look here, you can see that it is just above and it's holding on. And it's tight enough that it's not going to fall out while I'm working. We have two types of files that we're going to be using for this. We have a flat bastard file. This is the one that basically has big teeth. And we have a mill bastard. This one's just single cut. That means it's going to make it nice and smooth. This one takes off more material at a time. The first thing we're going to do with the flat bastard is cross file. We're going to hold it in one of our hands, left or right, up to you. Going to be going forward, applying a little bit of downward pressure and going across the metal. We're going to do that to both faces of the material. Once you've done that, you can go grab your mill bastard, and now we're going to draw file. I'm going to hold it in my left hand because of the angle of these teeth, essentially. I'm going to be pressing down, going forward, back and forth like this. Don't move your entire body. Plant your feet, move your arms, and you're pretty much good to go. Now, I'm only using this part. As it gets dirty, let's use this part, and this part, and this part, and this part. Back and forth. So you can see where I filed it here. That was what we had before. We want to get it down like this so it's nice and flat, nice and smooth. You should be able to close your eyes and feel the difference when you touch it. Do that to both faces. Start with the flat bastard all the way across, both sides, and then use the mill bastard. One thing you'll see as you're going, there's going to end up being kind of a stripe down the middle that's a little bit harder to get to. That's because the metal isn't actually flat when you start. It has a little bit of a scoop to it. Now you probably can't see it, but it is there. Now it's time to switch over to the mill bastard. That's the smoother looking one. This is the one that we are going to use for draw filing. So my faces are done. Now it's time to do the edges here. The quickest way to do this is to clamp it in a vise, and we're going to draw file with a mill bastard. You can, to protect the face from getting any marks from the inside of your jaws here on the vise, you can use a piece of paper towel wrapped around it, or you can use a set of soft jaws. I'm going to use soft jaws here for this one. Clamp it with the top slightly above. This should take less than a minute for each side. Again, using the mill bastard. I'm going to draw a file, hold it in my left hand, go for it. Don't stab yourself in the stomach on the other end. Try to get rid of any of the dark colored marks or pits. Your metal will sometimes heat up while you're working. That's because of the friction. Be careful not to burn your hands. You don't really need to wear gloves, just be careful. One of the next things I'm going to be doing is getting some 220 grit sandpaper and do a quick sanding of everything. I've cut off a strip so it's easier to handle. I can cut this up, supply it with a whole bunch of students. So now that everything's smooth, we're going to round over both edges of our material. You want to use something like a small coin to do this. I'm going to hold it around the edge here, and I can use a marker, a scribe, whatever tools I really have to do this. Do that to both ends so that it's even. If you don't have a coin, you can use your thumb or not. If you look closely, you might be able to see it because of the light. There's going to be a small edge. I'm going to take that over to the bench grinder and grind that over now. So we can bring our material over to the bench grinder, but before we start, a little bit of safety. When using a bench grinder, it's a good idea to wear a full face mask. Don't always rely on just this and a pair of glasses. You don't want to have any of this explode and go in your face, or this fly off and go in your face, or sparks go off and fly in your face. So protect your face. As you're working with your material, it's going to get warm. Friction as this thing is going. We have a lovely bucket of beautiful British Columbia water here. It's not drinkable, but it's good enough for cooling your material down as it gets hot. So keep one of these handy, refill it. Again, cover your face. You want to double check that the gap is probably less than 1/8 of an inch, or maybe 2 millimeters. You just want enough clearance for this to spin, but not enough for your material to get sucked down. We're going to use the top of this little table right here. We're not going to hold it up on the air. We're not going to hold it off on the side, just on the face or the front of the stone as it's spinning. I'm going to curve this in kind of a pendulum motion and get a nice rounded edge over here. Don't just jam it into one place, always try to keep it moving. Once that side is done and you have a nice curve on the top, flip it over and let's do the other side. We want the two to match. If they don't look the same, fix it. If you don't have access to a bench grinder, by the way, you can also just use a file and round it over. Let's keep going. So now that both of those ends look the same, and they should match the coin that you used for both ends, like that, you should be good. Give it a quick buzz with the file to make sure there's no burrs. You should be able to run your finger along it and it shouldn't be sharp anywhere. Now it's time to move on to a little bit of layout. You're going to need a ruler for this one, or rule, whatever you decide to call it. For the most accurate layout, I recommend using a scribe. If you don't have a scribe, you could use a nail, maybe the edge of a center punch. You could like sharpen your fingernails. I don't know, you could pull out a... We'll stick to the scribe. We're going to measure from one end, we're going to measure 1/4 of an inch. Lay your ruler right on top of there. Set it up to the edge, not hanging over this way. Line it up right on the corner, nice and flush, and measure 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to use my scribe to scratch that in there. I'm going to flip it over to the other side. I'm also going to lay this one out at 1/4 of an inch. Line it up on the edge, 1/4 of an inch. If you can't quite see it, do it darker. If you want to make sure that you have a nice straight line, you can do this. Grab a square, line that up, use your scribe, and you can get a nice straight line going across like that. Do that to the other side as well. So we now have 2 layout lines. Next, we're going to add a third one. This is going to go 1 inch away from that line here. We're going to be drilling holes here later, and it's very important that this hole and this hole are exactly 1 inch apart. If you want to, you could also put this over here and measure 1 1/4. But you do need to double check that you are exactly 1 inch apart. I'm going to line it up here so you can see that it's on my 1/4 inch line, and I'm going to do 1 1/4. Scratch that in. layout lines. So now I have three layout lines. 1, 2, and then another one on the other side. We want to measure directly in the middle. If this stuff is 1/2 inch wide, half of that is 1/4. Put a little scratch line in there. Put a little scratch line in your next one. Flip it over, do the exact same thing over here. Put a little scratch line in there. Excellent. Next thing we're gonna need is a center punch. I'm gonna take this over to a hard surface and hit it with a hammer. I'm taking my material over to our anvil. For this, you're using a center punch, not a scribe. If you don't have either of these, you could use a carpenter nail or something like that, a screw, anything that's going to be able to dent in, but don't use the school scribes for this. Put it back on the tool board where it belongs. So I'm going to line up my center punch exactly on those scribe lines that I made. I'm going to line those up. Take your time, get it right the first time, line it up, and give it one good hit. So what that should look like right here, you can see where I have that little dent. It's right on the line, it's fairly deep. It's gonna be big enough that a drill bit is able to really catch it when we try to drill. Let's do that to the other sides now. So line that up, make sure it's underneath a nice hard surface when you do this. Take your time to line up exactly where your holes are gonna go. Don't hit it until you're 100% sure that your layout lines are also perfect. Exactly 1 inch apart. Lovely. One more right here, right in the center. Now it's time to head over to the drill press. We're going to be using a 964 drill bit. You can double check our drill bits by sticking into the drill bit gauge. I want to use a 964. If it fits into the 1/8, you have the wrong size. So 964. We're going to be using 1/8 rivets to hold this whole thing together. So we're going to go just slightly one size bigger, give it a little bit of extra wiggle room. I'm going to be holding my material in a vise. Use the slot that is here to hold it. Don't just put it up on top. If you use the slot, it's going to make sure that it holds it in nice and straight. Tighten it up and keep the long edge of the material on your left. Install your drill bit into the chuck. Tighten. Double check that it's centered with a little hand spin. And then we can go ahead and line up where our holes are. I recommend for you guys just starting out, line it up with the machine off first, double check that it's actually in the right place, push it in the hole, you give it a little spin, you're good to go. All right, time to drill. You don't need to press hard. I'm gonna use one finger to do this. Line up your next hole and drill. As you're drilling, you want to see chips coming off. If there's no chips coming off, either you're not pressing hard enough or you have a dull drill bit. Final hole, again, nice and slow. Turn off the machine, take out your material. After you've drilled your holes, you might notice a small burr on the other side of your metal. A quick fix for that is to grab a drill bit that is larger than the hole you drilled, stick it in the hole, and give it a couple spins just by hand. You don't need to go grab a 1-inch drill bit or anything like this, just something that is slightly bigger. So if you look closely on that one, you see there's a small burr there. That's what a good drill bit's good for getting rid of, so you don't slice your hand open on it. Nice and smooth. Excellent. It's almost like using a countersink. So now that we have our holes all set up, we're gonna be bending this piece of metal into the shape of a handle. Our first bend line, we're gonna set this up here, and we're gonna measure 1 inch and 3/4 from the end, so just under 2 inches. This is an important number. So measure that over 1 inch, 3/4. Get a nice little scratch in there. Use your square, lay that out, so you have a nice, easy to see line. There you go, see that line? 1 3/4 there. So using my same piece of paper towel, because I'm gonna reuse this a couple times throughout here, better to save the environment and all that, I'm gonna wrap this around just underneath where I made that mark to protect it, and I'm gonna line that line up with the top of my vise. Do your best to make sure that the material is straight up and down and not on a big angle. So line that up, get that nice and as straight kind of by eye. You could use this if you like. Tighten up your vise so it's not going anywhere. Next thing we want to do is grab a ball peen hammer, and we're going to be putting some pressure on it with our hand and hitting it here. We're using ball peens because that's what we have in the shop, and we're not using the ball peen here because we don't want to put dents in our metal. We want to bend this now to a 45-degree angle. So if this square is 90, I want this to bend down to half of that. It's down to about 45. Put a little bit of pressure on there with your hands, tap it here. Now the reason that we're not just pressing down with our hands on it is we're gonna end up with a rounded curve or a rounded bend. I wanna get a nice sharp bend. So hit that a couple times. If you can do it by eyeball, awesome. If not, use a square. That looks just about 45, a little bit more. Pretty good. If it's not perfect, that's all right. I'm gonna show some tricks later for how to fix that in a minute. After I've bent that, I'm gonna take it out of the vise, and I'm gonna open up the vise to hold my bending jig. That's right. This is my trowel jig. I've been using this same piece of 2 3/4 inch OD for about 10 years now. Hold that in the vise, don't try to squish it, just enough to hold it in there. Now we're gonna set it up. Using your same piece of paper towel, you're gonna wrap it around the middle, or approximate middle of your piece here. Just wrap that around. And then using a pair of locking pliers, I want to attach it. Now it's very important the direction of your material. I'm gonna flip this around so you can see it better. I wanna have this facing away from me, not towards me. So have it facing away from you. We're gonna clamp it to the pipe so it's not going anywhere. Again, facing away from you. Facing away from you. I'm gonna bend these towards myself so that these holes here line up with the hole here. That way the ends are gonna match. If you're not strong enough, you can use a bit of pressure with your hands and hit it with a hammer. Go around to the other side. Do a little bit. And you wanna do a little bit at a time so that they match up. So I'm gonna line that up a little bit at a time, and I want this hole to line up with here. I should be able to see through it. And here's where you can see that I bent it a little bit too much. Oh darn, it's almost like I did this on purpose so I can show you how to fix it. I'm gonna get it as close as I can where I think those two ends are gonna line up. So if this happens to you and you didn't quite bend it at exactly the angle you want, we're gonna take it out of the vise, remove the bending jig, but don't lose it. Take my same piece of paper towel, and I'm gonna wrap it around here and clamp this end into the vise. I'm gonna clamp it with that bend line pretty close to in line with this. Move my finger out of the way for, reasons. Line that up as best you can, keep it straight up and down. Now the act of clamping itself isn't gonna do anything. I'm gonna open it, that metal's just gonna spring back. So I'm gonna add a quick little bend, push it this way, pull it this way, just a little. And just that amount here should be enough to have flattened it together. There's a slight bend there, so I want to bend it maybe just a little bit more. There we go, nice and put together. Those ends are within 1/2 millimeter, very small, it's good. And I should be able to see through those two holes. So the handle's pretty much done. It's gonna need some sanding, and that's about it. We've got a really nice shape right here. So now that the handle's done, we're gonna move on to making the actual shovel head or trowel head. I have a template here. You can download that. I've been using this template for about 10 years, and I'm sure before that, this template has been used for many, many years before this. I wanna cut it out as best I can, exactly on the lines. Remember back to kindergarten? I don't. Other than getting a gold sticker for being able to count to 100 and then back again. That's literally it. That and making towers out of blocks. So this template is going to be serving two excellent purposes. One is to get the shape onto our metal, and two is for where we're going to be drilling our holes. If I'm going to measure the distance between those two little marks there, I wonder what it's going to be. Exactly 1 inch. To get it onto my template, instead of just tracing it, I can grab a little stick of glue here. Don't be afraid to go crazy with the glue. The more the better. Well, not too much more. Please don't eat the glue. Although I'm not sure how much that would affect things. You'd have to ask Miss Slippy. Once you have that all set up, don't just glue it randomly onto your piece. I recommend finding 2 edges and line it up with 2 edges here. That means 2 less cuts that you're gonna have to make. Line that up here. And we have a little bit of overhang. Why do I have a little bit of overhang? Because when you have to cut out 60 of these for your students, it's okay to cut them a little bit big. For this, I'm using 18 gauge steel. You could also use 20 or 22. If you go too thin, your shovel's just gonna break. Next thing, we need to cut this out. I'm gonna be cutting it out with the Beverly shear and then finishing it all with the file. If you don't have a Beverly shear or something like that, you could try to use hand snips. But in order to use those, you need big muscles, and not all students have big muscles. If you use the Beverly shear for this, there's a couple tips. One is don't stick your finger in between the blades. For that reason, I've called it the pepperoni shear, because there's a story where somebody I knew was rushing, got a little bit too close to it with the big meaty part of the palm, and cut off a piece of pepperoni, similar to what you'd see at a deli when you're going and asking for 400 grams of honey ham. Anyway, so open that thing up, keep your fingers out of there, keep it flat here, hold it nice and tight, line up your cut, shear off the straight parts first because they are the easiest. The straight parts can also be done on the foot shear. Line it up. If you go a little big, that's okay because you can file it down and make it perfect. But hot darn, that looks pretty good to me. One more cut here. I'm gonna cut off these little nubs here with the shear as well. Again, I'm gonna cut them just slightly big, finish it with a file. Don't cut smaller than the paper. A bunch of tiny little straight cuts will eventually look like a curve. Always keep your eye on the blade, stand on the left side of the machine so that you can actually see what you're doing, regardless of if you are left or right-handed. This whole time, I'm not taking the paper off of my metal. I want to keep my template on as long as I can to ensure that my metal is the size it's supposed to be. This shouldn't take very long to do. So after you've done your rough cut out of this, one of the good things to do is to get a center punch and center punch where our holes are going to go. We're not going to drill them yet, but we're going to do this just in case this piece of paper falls off. The glue doesn't always hold too well. So I'm gonna go ahead and center punch those. Just make sure you're on a mostly solid surface for this. Line it up, take your time, get it as perfect as you are able to. Even if it's a little punch, that's all right. Ideally, it's best to go over to the anvil to do this, but I'd rather have a little dot in there than none at all. Next thing we want to do is smooth it out, try to get it as exact as we can to the paper template that's on here. We're going to be doing this with just a file. So I'm just going to install that there with a pair of soft draws so that I don't squish or put any marks on this more than I need to. And your best bet is actually to be doing draw filing. Cross filing is going to annoy everybody around you. Let's have a listen. Compared to draw filing, much quieter. Now if you have to do a cross file, do it quick, get it out of the way so that nobody has to listen to your annoying noises. So whether you're draw filing this way or this way, as long as you're going this way along your metal, that's gonna be better. If you don't like filing this, cut it better the first time. I also like to round over these edges a little bit. It's gonna make it smoother for anybody who has to touch it. It's not gonna cut any better or worse through dirt, but it'll feel a little bit nicer in your hands. Makes it look a little bit more finished. I really want things to look even and symmetrical, so I do want to make sure that I don't have any flat spots where there should be round spots. So now that I'm happy with how this turned out symmetrically, I want to quickly sand all the scratches and some of these things off. I think this thing looks pretty good. I might need to round over a little bit more, but I can do that afterwards. I'm gonna do a quick sanding, finish this up, and get it ready for drilling and then bending. So So once it has been all sanded, smooth, filed edges, and everything looks symmetrical, so if I was to draw a line down the middle, it looks symmetrical on both sides, then we're going to drill one hole. Now we're not drilling both, we are drilling one. We're only going to drill the top one. I'm going to be using one of these just because it's a little bit easier to use with a hand drill. You can drill this with the drill press, but I personally don't like drilling small pieces of sheet metal with a drill press. There's a chance of them spinning around and slicing your hand open. The other way to do it is with this. If your shop has one of these, that works as well. Unfortunately, I do not have the right size bit. So because I don't have the right size for my Whitney punch, I'm just going to use one of these with my hand drill. When holding it by hand, you can wear a glove if you like, but just be careful. You can also plunge cut or plunge drill, where you're just doing a little bit like that at a time. I'm only going to do the top one, an 1/8 inch. Make sure you're centered, and we still want those to be inching apart. Look at the back and see if there is a burr. We want to get rid of that either with a file or with that other trick that I used with an extra drill bit. We just want to smooth it out. We're not trying to drill the hole this size. Go ahead and sand off any marks that you might have made. I usually don't make that mark, but for illustrative purposes, I use the Sharpie. We're gonna go send this to the slip form roller, or form slip roller, roll slip form whatever, and I'm gonna show you how to do a nice curve on this thing. So this is one of our older pieces of equipment in the shop. It's pretty easy to use, but it's also pretty easy to mess up. We're going to be putting our material through that little gap there, and by that I mean material, not our fingers. If you put your fingers in, they're going to come out a different shape if you can make it all the way through. On our machine, we have some knobs down here, and this is going to lower or raise this first roller. I want to make sure that it's at least engaged with the teeth here that are causing it to go, so let me just raise it up, and then you can see the other one start spinning as well. And then I want to make sure that it's actually going to fit. It's got to have the thickness, so I can bring it down for a big piece, make it tighter for a small piece like this. So when I pass this through, it should get pulled through just by cranking it. I don't want to have my fingers holding it like this. I'm going to put my hand open on the back and push it through. Now it's easy to go through right now because I haven't adjusted the whole machine, but we're still getting set up. So on the back of the machine is the other roller. So the height here is going to determine how much curve I can get here. That's controlled by this knob, so the higher it is, the more curve. However, I can't just run it through at the highest setting in the first go. I'm gonna have to run it through a little bit and adjust. Run it through and adjust. Run it through and adjust. And I'm gonna do that on both sides. So I can push that through here, and it's not really gonna do anything. It's still flat. So I need to adjust those rollers up, and I wanna keep it even here. I'm gonna start with maybe about 1/4 inch of space. For most students, they're not strong enough to just crank it all the way up and push it through at once. They gotta start slow. So I'm gonna try it at about this height. So push it through, don't push it through this way. Make sure you push it through going through this way. Open palm, give it a press, start cranking. So here you can see I have a very slight curve. I want more because it's gonna be a good little shovel. Both sides till it's even. I'm gonna give them maybe one turn. Open palm, push through. I want a little bit more than that still. Open palm, push through. There we go. I'm happy with that. That's a decent little arc there. I'm happy with that curve. And we are almost ready to assemble our pieces. So since we're using hand rivets for this, the rivet's gonna be going through the top first and out the bottom. When we hammer the hand rivets on, it needs something to bite on. So we're gonna be using this countersink bit to countersink this hole just a little bit. Hold that into a vise as best you are able to. This one wobbles a little bit, but I'm gonna cheat and it's not gonna matter. We're gonna be going down just a little until it's done. Nice and slow, and that's it. So when you look closely at it, it's just a very small amount that we've countersunk. That's gonna be more than enough to hold it in with the rivets. So these rivets that I have here, they come in some different lengths, but they're all the same diameter. These are all 1/8 inch rivets for this project. I wanna make sure I pick one that's not too long, but not too short. So for example, there's a short one and there's a long one. Let's test them and figure out which ones you're gonna use. To assemble this, we're gonna be sticking through the top, through your shovel, out the back. Might be a little bit tricky, and then it pops through here. So you can see that it's coming through the back. Now that's how much I'm gonna have to hammer it. If I don't wanna hammer it as much, I could get a shorter rivet and it would still work just fine. So let's try a shorter rivet. Through the top with the round part here, put your shovel head or trowel head in between the two, push it through until you see it coming out the back. Now looking at this, it's coming through a little bit. I only see it coming out maybe a millimeter or two. When I squish that down with the ball peen hammer, it will bite, but it's not going to be too much. I'm going to do it anyways and see how it turns out. So in order to do this with the rivets, I have a thing here called a rivet set. The rivet set has a little bowl in it for this to sit in. I'm going to hold this in my bench vise. I'm going to assemble all my pieces. I'm going to use the short rivet for this one. Pop that through. I'm not going to put it in upside down or on the bottom. It goes like this. And I'm going to put this little bump right here into that little spot right there. Now you can see I have the short end. I'm going to have that facing this side so that this big chunk doesn't hit here and make any big dents. So once that's in there, I really have to squeeze with my hand here, and I'm going to use the ball peen side of it to hit around it to make it look like a little mushroom and fill up that gap. So after 2 seconds, it's already strong enough to hold it in just by filling that little countersink area up. Let's finish that. I want to get it as flat down there as I'm able. Nice. If I look closely at this, I shouldn't be able to see any gaps of light coming through here or here. I want it to be nice and tight together. I'm going to go ahead and figure out how to stick another rivet in. It goes through the top, but it doesn't come through here. I wonder why. So the reason that we only drilled one hole in the piece of sheet metal and only one hole on this side is just in case students are unable to measure their 1 inch perfectly. Because of this, I'm able to take this to the drill press, drill through here as a guide, all the way through the sheet metal, through the back, and then I can put a rivet in after I've countersunk the hole. Let's go over to the drill press and do that now. So I have my 1/8 drill bit installed here. There's a couple ways to hold your material. If you put it on top of your vise like this, it'll probably work. But if you have your shovel head crooked and then you drill, it's not going to work very well. We do have our center punch, which should show up underneath there. And if we're lucky, it'll go through, and hopefully this doesn't shift while we're drilling. A trick that I use is I'm going to turn this to the side a little bit, and I'm going to use this little right angle here as a way to hold that shovel head in there nice and tight. I want to make sure that everything is flat so I don't have a hole that goes crooked, and then I'm ready to drill. Normally I don't like to drill outside of the drill vise area. It's going to make it fall over. But if you're very close to it, you should be all right. So I'm going to line that up, turn it on, and drill through. So there we go. We have our hole coming out the back. It should be all nice and lined up, and it looks pretty straight to me. What do we need to do to the back of it before we put a rivet in? We need to countersink it. So let's get our countersink bent and do that as well. Now this one's a little bit harder to hold in here. If I do it like this, I'm going to risk bending that if it's not a very strong piece of metal. But I'm going to be very careful, and we're really not pressing hard. I'm going to tighten that in there. I want to keep it mostly flat. Should be okay. I'm going to set up this area, line it up, and I'm going to drill down just a little bit. As the French would say, un peu. If you look closely there, you can really see how I've countersunk it just a little bit. If I was to go for depth, I would say it's just a fraction of a millimeter, barely a 1/16, hardly a parsec, whatever unit of measurement you are using. So here's a closer look at what the rivet set looks like. Rivet head's able to go in there, it's just slightly bigger, gives you a little bit of wiggle room. Again, just be careful that this edge doesn't bash your project. So I have my rivet in again. Remember, round part up top. This part's coming out here just a little bit. It is fine to use the longer ones, it just takes a little bit longer to hammer, but we're not going to use those right now. Put the round part of the rivet into the round part of the rivet set, get your ball peen hammer, and begin to hit. So you can see me hitting around the outside of it. If you're not strong, grip your handle closer. Once you've got it nice and tight in there, it's okay to switch to the flat side of your hammer. Redo the other one a little bit if you need to. Double check that this is still standing straight up and down. Nice and flat. Should be good. All right, some final steps is going to be polishing, making it nice and smooth. I could even take a file to this and file it down nice and flat so you don't even feel it. I'm going to do that quickly, and then maybe we're ready for finishing or paint. Draw file any spots that still need it. It's okay to round over these edges a little bit so it's comfortable to hold. I would say that this project is done. Paint it so that it doesn't rust. I'm just gonna use some spray paint for it. You could also dip it in a big bucket of marine paint or something if you really want to make it last. But I think this project turned out pretty sweet. This is just a very simple junior metal project. I know there's other ways to do these things, but this is the simple way that I teach it so that students are able to do it with basic hand tools. It's a good little introductory project. Feels smooth there. You can still see the bumps, but you can't really feel them. Nice. All right, I hope you enjoyed this. You can check out the plans on the website for the template here. Make sure to print it at 100%, and after you print, measure here to double check that the print came out with those at 1 inch apart. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe, share, like, comment. Any questions, I will do my best to answer for you guys. Have an awesome day. Bye.